Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 16th Annual Women's Policy Leadership Institute, or WPLI. I hope you are all warm and cozy where you're joining us from. We have a few more people trickling in, so we are going to wait for one more minute, and then we will get started with our opening plenary and racial wealth divide workshop. Okay, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is S.J. Howell. I'm the Executive Director of Montana Women Vote, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to the opening plenary and the kickoff for the 2022 Women's Policy Leadership Institute. The Women's Policy Leadership Institute, or WPLI, as we call it, is a program of Montana Women Vote. Montana Women Vote is a statewide organization of low-income women, families, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and their allies. And we work statewide to engage folks in the democratic process as informed voters, policy advocates, and community leaders. And we're really excited for the next week of workshops, panels, and skills labs. The presenters who are going to share with us, and for all of you for joining in the upcoming conversations and community building work. We hope that the information that we have to present to you over the next week will inform your efforts in your communities, help all of us continue to build and create change and tackle the issues that most impact ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities. I'm going to take just a moment up front to go over a few technology and housekeeping notes. So this panel is webinar style. That means that all of you participants are automatically muted, and you won't be able to unmute yourself without the tech host's permission. So if you want to be unmuted, you can click the microphone icon in the bottom left of your screen. Or if you're on the phone, press *6, and we can unmute you if you want to ask a question in person. But we encourage you to ask questions and engage with other participants in either the chat or the Q&A functions on Zoom. The chat is the little dialogue box in the middle of your screen, and the Q&A is two little dialogue boxes on the right-hand side of your screen. It seems like there might not be a mic option, and we'll see if we can get that turned on as we go. The Q&A is really helpful specifically for questions that you have for presenters or panelists, and we'll try to keep an eye on that and review it throughout the presentation and during the Q&A section. And the chat is a great place for you to share your thoughts, engage with other participants, or ask questions if you'd like to there as well. We have closed captioning available if captions are helpful. You can turn your captions off and on and adjust the size of those captions by clicking on the live transcript box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have questions or technical difficulties with any of this, you can put them in the chat, or if you need to, you can call staff directly here at the office at 406-317-1505, and we will put that number into the chat, and hopefully someone can help you with any technical difficulties. We are recording this session, and we'll be recording all the sessions of WPLI. So if you missed something or you want to go back and review, those recordings will be provided on our website after the end of the conference. At the end of the session, we are going to provide a short online evaluation. These evaluations are really helpful for us. We review them, we read every single one of them. They help us put together WPLI every year, and we really do welcome the input and feedback from folks. So we encourage you to take a minute when we're done here, stay on your computer and fill that out. As a bonus, we are going to raffle off several prizes. We have some Visa gift cards, and we also have 3 signed copies of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, which is a fantastic book written by our keynote speaker, Aubrey Gordon. And every time you fill out an evaluation, your name will get entered into that raffle. So the more workshops you attend and evaluations you fill out, the more chances you have to win one of those prizes. And those, again, we will provide the link for those evaluations at the end of the session, and it's also available on our website. So those are our tech notes. Before we go any further, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge, as we gather here at WPLI from all parts of the state, that we are all joining this event from land that we now call Montana, but land that was the traditional homeland and common hunting grounds of many tribes, and is today home to 12 sovereign tribes with well over 67,000 enrolled members. Those of us who are not Indigenous or Black acknowledge that we're settlers on this land, and we benefit from the colonization and oppression of Indigenous people, past and present. I also want to note that we're gathering here today in February, Black History Month. We recognize the invaluable and incomparable contributions of Black people every month. And we take this month especially to lift up and highlight the leadership and excellence of Black people now and in the past. And it's particularly important to acknowledge that Montana has had many thriving Black communities whose history is often overlooked or purposefully erased, and who shaped Montana in many ways. We have the full language of our land acknowledgement and a great traditional lands map available on our website, and I encourage you to make sure you take a look at that. So here we are. Welcome to WPLI. I'm so excited that you all are here. If folks want to take a moment to drop into the chat a short introduction, your name, what city you're joining us from, and your pronouns, that's a great way to see who's here and to maybe see some familiar names or meet some new people. I want to take another moment to just talk a little bit about what we have coming up for the rest of the week. All of this information is available on our website, and that link is in the chat. But we have a full week of really exciting and powerful workshops and panels coming up. I'm going to read through them just briefly. If you've registered with us, which of course you have, you probably saw a list, but I want to say again that it's worth considering joining as many as you can. They're going to be really exciting. Tomorrow, Thursday, we have Voting Rights in Montana, a panel from noon to 1:30. And tomorrow evening from 5:30 to 7, we have our keynote speaker with Aubrey Gordon, who's the co-host of the hit podcast Maintenance Phase and the author of the book I mentioned earlier, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. On Friday, we have a panel on climate inequity from noon to 1:30. That's going to be really exciting. It's a topic we haven't spent a lot of time digging into in the past, and we're really excited to have that space for that conversation this year. On Saturday and Sunday, we have 4 workshops that are our skills labs. If you've been to WPLI before, you know that skills labs are really designed to present usable information that you can take into your everyday lives to help make more of an impact on the issues that you're working on. On Saturday, our first skills lab is how to run for office from 2 to 3 p.m. And our second skills lab, also on Saturday, is storytelling through independent journalism from 3 to 4 p.m. On Sunday, we have 2 more skills labs, navigating the legislature from 2 to 3 p.m. and local elections and municipal organizing from 3 to 4 p.m. On Monday, we have an evening panel that's rethinking criminal justice reform from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Tuesday, we have healthcare policy in 2022 from noon to 1:30. And we will wrap up with possibly our best panel Wednesday evening, what's at stake in Indian country, looking at Indigenous policy at the local, state, and federal level. Again, Wednesday, 5:30 to 7. So I know that's a lot. Every single one of those panels is going to be worth your time. You can find the entire list again on our website or on our social media, and we hope you'll join for as much as makes sense for you. And one last tech note, this year we are using Slack. Slack is a place to chat, connect with others, discuss what you've heard, share ideas. You all should have gotten an email invite to join the conference Slack. If you haven't, again, let us know either in the chat or you can email one of our staff or call that phone number. And we're happy to help support you joining or using Slack. But I think this is a great place where we can hopefully have a little more depth of connection and conversation despite us having a virtual WPLI again this year. So lastly, in our sort of housekeeping and notes, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Even though we don't get to come together in person this year, WPLI still costs money, and we want to be sure that we provide the best and most accessible experience to everyone we can. And we can't do this without our sponsors. So I want to take a moment to thank the Montana Budget and Policy Center, Montana Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Forward Montana, Blue Mountain Clinic, Planned Parenthood of Montana, and the Women's Foundation of Montana. Every one of these sponsors helped us put this conference on, and again, we thank them very much. We couldn't do it without them. So let's talk just briefly about WPLI. I said earlier, this is our 16th annual WPLI, which means that for well over a decade, we have been putting on this conference. And it was really created as a space where low-income folks and their families and allies could come together to learn, to build relationships, and to take action. It's been one of our favorite things that we do every year. It's a chance to meet new people, to learn about amazing work happening in communities across the state, and to strengthen our skills. And I think it's really important, especially right now when opportunities for connection and deep conversations feel harder to come by, that we make a space where we can really dig into the topics that we have ahead of us, whether they are learning more in depth about policy, becoming policy experts in our own right, in our own communities, whether it's really strengthening our skills so that we can continue to show up and do this hard work of social and racial justice. And most importantly, it's about building those relationships, knowing that we are not the only ones who are doing this work, that there's always exciting and creative work out there for us to learn from. and that when we work together, our work is easier and better. Once again, we're virtual this year, and that's different than usual, but we're still really excited to share with all of you, to meet you virtually over the coming week, and to get to dig into some of these topics. I want to talk just very briefly about Montana Women Vote, the organization bringing this conference to you. We were founded over 20 years ago now, just as a voter registration project. It's a pretty neat story, actually, how a bunch of organizers got together, saw a need, and made it happen. And now, more than 2 decades later, we're a full-fledged organization with over 6 staff doing policy work, community organizing, and leadership development. And I'm going to name and briefly introduce each of our staff. If you join workshops throughout the week, you'll get a chance to see and hear from all of them. As I said, I'm S.J. Howell, the executive director. Ella Smith is our program director. And we have a fantastic team of community organizers: Danny Vasquez, Destiny Vale, Hannah Pate, and D.V. Cole. They're all amazing people. I couldn't be more lucky to work with such fantastic colleagues. And they've all done an incredible amount of work to get us here to today's WPLI kickoff. So last thing I'm going to leave you with is just a few words about Montana Women Vote's priorities in 2022. The last few years have been rough. They have been unexpected. They have been different. The challenges that we have faced, from the political to the pandemic, have been really unique. And there's a lot of work ahead of us to rebuild community, to protect the rights and recognitions that we all deserve, and to invest in the programs and services that keep families safe and strong and healthy. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we're focusing on organizationally in 2022, but I also will say again that over the course of the next week, you'll hear not just about our work, but about really amazing work being led by community leaders and organizations across the state. One of the big pieces of work that we have ahead of us is voter registration and civic engagement. The fact is, important elections happen every year. This year is no different. We have a chance to elect people up and down the ballot. And there's also going to be some big issues directly on the ballot in the shape of legislative referenda and citizens initiatives. Those issues include things like abortion rights, they include tax policy, they might include a variety of other issues, and we'll know that more as the year shapes up. And of course, in last year's legislative session, there were a number of attacks on voting rights, making it harder for people to register and harder for people to vote. And so it's more important than ever, not just that we dig into those policies and work on the policy end of things, which again, we'll talk more about tomorrow at noon, but also that we're out in communities, meeting folks where they're at, providing access to voter registration and access to information about what's on the ballot. So we're going to be doing a lot of that work. We're going to be doing that work with a number of our partners and allies. And you'll probably see us out in the communities with our clipboards in front of the grocery stores again soon as it's safe. Another big piece of our work is interim legislative work and policy development. And there's just a few things that I want to name here. One is really the opportunity that we have to invest a lot of the federal money that has come into the state through COVID relief funds, whether it's ARPA or maybe the potential for Build Back Better to pass, even the infrastructure funds that passed last year. The truth is, this is frankly a really historic opportunity. It's an amount of money that the state very rarely has to spend. And, you know, it's a fair question. What are we investing in? We can use this money for communities. We can get it into the hands of people who need it the most. Or we can do other things. We can see that money wasted, squandered, or spent in the ways that benefit folks who have the most already. So we're really pushing to make sure that we're using this opportunity, we're using that money in the best way possible. We are also, as we have for many years, continuing to work on Medicaid expansion and healthcare more broadly. And in the context of the public health pandemic, there have been policy changes, rule changes from the federal level to the local level, and all of those impact our ability to access healthcare, to ensure that low-income folks have quality health coverage. And that work continues on today and throughout the year and into next year's session. We continue our work organizationally on criminal legal reform. We know that our criminal justice system doesn't work. It's punitive, it's costly, and it's harmful. And we want to make sure that we can continue to push for both the small immediate policy changes and the bigger picture visions for a system that supports and invests and lifts up communities instead of locking people into cages. And as always, we'll continue our work on Indigenous justice and state tribal relations, both through the legislative session and the state tribal policy intersection, and in community organizing and community-led efforts across the state. Lastly, I'll just say that, as I mentioned before, we have work ahead of us to rebuild community, to rebuild relationships, to remember what it is to do this work together. We hope to be out in communities with all of you as soon as it's safe, whether in smaller in-person events or out talking to folks at the grocery stores and the offices of public assistance, doing voter registration. There'll be lots of volunteer opportunities, again, when it's safe, and we hope to see you all there. So that's the end of my opening. I'm so excited that you're all here. Welcome to WPLI. I hope you stick around and continue to join us for the rest of the week. And I'm really excited to hand it over to Ella and Hannah for the racial wealth divide.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. We're super excited to be kicking off WPLI and to be talking about a really important topic this evening. Before Hannah and I get started, and while I pull up our slides here, I just wanted to plug the Slack one more time. It's a really great way to stay engaged during the conference and to join some affinity groups and meet each other. And I think that one of the things we really miss about being able to do this conference in person is the ability to really build community with each other. So use the link in the chat and follow your email and join the Slack. And we hope to connect with you and discuss the content that we're all here to share over the next couple days.
Cool. Hey everyone. My name is Hannah and my pronouns are they, she, and I'm a community organizer with Montana Women Vote. We're moving into the segment of our agenda called the Racial Wealth Divide. This session will be an overview of wealth, race, and related policies at Montana Women Vote. As a reminder, this workshop is webinar style. You're muted automatically and are not able to unmute yourself without permission. To request to be unmuted, you can raise your hand. If you're on the phone, you can press #6. So you can ask questions using the chat or the Q&A function found below. And we'll be checking that Q&A throughout the workshop in order to answer your questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or call our staff at 406-317-1505. We're recording this session, so if you missed anything, we've got you covered. So now that that's covered, let's set some community ground rules and best practices. So share the air or wait, ask yourself, why am I talking? Be respectful of others, act and speak with best intentions, and understand that your words and actions have an impact. Confidentiality is super important here. If someone shares their story, don't out their experience. Stories that are shared here stay here, but lessons that are learned, you can feel free to take with you. Be sure to ask questions, but ask the right people. Speak from your own experience, and just know that oppression exists, but there's no debating that, and we don't need to recreate those dynamics here. When you make a mistake, say oops or thank you and move on, and acknowledge and honor your feelings that may arise during this session, but challenge yourself to stay in the moment and be here to learn. So let's talk about when something happens. So interrupting oppressive moments. Take a deep breath, name the behavior, not the person. So say that joke was inappropriate, say why it's wrong. Jokes like that rely on racist stereotypes that are hurtful, and give a direction, give a next step. So say, please don't make jokes like that again, is an example. When you receive difficult feedback, first, just like stop your first reaction, really stop, count to 10, take a breath, wait, listen very carefully to what the other person is saying. Thank that person for giving you feedback. Like I said earlier, overly apologizing or explaining yourself and your mistake centers yourself over the harmed party, and process with an appropriate person at an appropriate time.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah.
Those tools are going to be really helpful for all of us, I think, throughout this conference, but especially as we talk today with some of our content. These subjects can be tricky and they're very personal, and it's important to have some tools to be able to interrupt moments that can be harmful, to be able to receive that feedback, and to be able to engage with each other, because we're all here to learn and share the space respectfully. So now we're going to get into the racial wealth divide. I'm going to review a little bit about what we're going to cover in the next hour. We'll start off with some definitions, spending a few minutes talking about income, wealth, race, and white supremacy. We'll then look at some charts and statistics that'll help us sort of understand how these concepts are differently distributed across races. We'll talk about the roots of the racial wealth divide, exploring how current policies continue the racial wealth divide and identifying ways that communities have resisted these policies. And then we'll talk about what policies Montana Women Vote is working on and some policy examples that other organizers and organizations are proposing to address the racial wealth divide. So Hannah and I are here to share this information and help us all better learn from each other. But honest conversations about inequality and inequity can be really uncomfortable. In order to create a safe space where we share and learn together, I just want to start off by reminding everybody the group agreements that Hannah started us off with, and to share some of the outcomes that we're hoping for and the assumptions that we're making as we go into this workshop. So the outcomes we're hoping for the next hour are to ground ourselves in how economic, gender, and racial justice are interrelated, to understand more about how race impacts the distribution of resources and privileges as allocated by government policies, and to reflect and connect our personal identity and family history to racialized policies and the impact that those policies have had on us. We're also heading into this conversation with a couple of assumptions. First, the next hour and the next week are part of a larger process of learning, taking action, and reflecting. It's geared towards positive social transformation. We say that this is only one part because there's a lot about the racial wealth divide that we will not be able to cover, obviously, today. It'll feel totally incomplete and unfinished by the time we finish our conversation today. And we hope you'll continue learning when you leave the space. We have provided some resources on our website that you can use to get started, but we also encourage you to build community with each other and find out what other people are using to learn. We're making another assumption that we all have multiple and complicated identities. We're not trying to simplify who you are in this conversation, but we do want to really focus specifically on how race and class intersect. And while we may be discussing the facts in somewhat an abstract and academic way over the next week and over the next hour, it's important for us all to remember that people's lives in this Zoom room and outside of it are directly impacted and harmed by systemic racism. So these policies are actively hurting people, and we encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. This is a learning space, but we also hope that it's a comfortable space, and we totally understand if you need to do whatever you need to do. And we also welcome your feedback and comments and suggestions throughout the conference. And lastly, you will notice that throughout the slideshow, many of our charts exclude Indigenous communities from the data sets. We have done our absolute best to find better charts and include updated statistics when possible, but the truth is that the lack of quality data on Indigenous communities is a clear and direct byproduct of generations of colonization and erasure. Through years of intentional government policies that removed land and resources, Indigenous peoples have been separated from wealth and assets that are rightfully theirs, and have been disenfranchised through the racial wealth divide, just like many other races. However, we don't necessarily have the greatest ability to provide charts that show Indigenous communities on par with other races. So we will do our best to sort of represent the best we can, and we hope that we can continue to advocate for better data collection in the future. If you have any questions during the presentation you'd like us to answer, we might not be able to answer them in the moment. So make free use of the Q&A and the chat box, and we will do our very best with the time that we have left as we approach 7 o'clock, as we want to respect everyone's time this evening. So now I'll turn it back over to Hannah.
Sweet, thank you. So when we talk about income, when economists talk about income, they're referring to your paycheck, government benefit check, or dividend check. For example, it may also be payments that you earn from your retirement account or a rental property. When we talk about wealth, it's what you own minus what you owe. So it's the total value of what you have in the bank, what you own in property or investments minus student debt, what you owe on your mortgage or any other debt that you might have. So you can see in this graphic, you can imagine a river running through a lake. The river running into the lake is income, and the river running away from the lake is your expenses. The lake, whatever is left over, is wealth. All right, so race, when we talk about that, we understand race is a social construct without biological meaning. However, it's a powerful social idea that has real consequences for people's lives. Assumptions about genetic differences between people of different races has had obvious social and historical repercussions, and they still threaten to fuel racist beliefs. So white supremacy is the idea or the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So white supremacy is a political, economic, and cultural system in which white people overwhelmingly control power and material resources, where conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread. So let's dig into one of the impacts of racism and white supremacy and look at what the racial wealth divide looks like. So this slide shows the median adjusted household income by race. Median is the middle value, meaning 50% of households have lower income and 50% of households have higher income. We see incomes between Black, Latino, white, and Asian households. We can see that there is a huge racial income gap. In 2016, white median household income was $65,000, while Latino household income was $48,000. Black household income was $40,000, and Native American household income, which is not shown on the graph, was also $40,000. The income gap between white and Black families has actually increased since 1967. We should also note that income inequality in the US is greatest among the Asian community. From 1970 to 2016, Asian households with higher incomes experienced a near doubling of income, while Asian households with lower incomes experienced no increase in the standard of living. This chart does not include data relating to Indigenous people, but based on the 2013 to 2017 American Community Survey, the median income of American Indian and Alaska Native households was $40,315, slightly lower than the median income of African American households. Okay. So let's talk about what's on this graph. So it shows similar outcomes starting in 1988 and going until 2020. You'll notice that there aren't any recent shifts in the trend lines between 2016 and 2020.
Thanks, Hannah. So this next slide helps us understand the gender wage gap a little bit. We see that the gender wage gap has narrowed over the last few decades. However, about 40% of the narrowing of the gender wage gap in the past 40 years has been due to the decline in men's wages, particularly low-wage workers, and about 60% is due to an increase in women's wages. While there are more well-paid women in the professions than in certain professions than there were 30 years ago, there are many more women who have been forced to enter low-paid service sector work, particularly women of color and immigrant women. And most of these low-paid jobs are low-paid because they've been considered quote unquote women's work. We don't necessarily, as similarly to Indigenous communities, and as was shared in the chat, it really does speak volumes that there are communities that are often left out of these graphics. And that's true for trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, two-spirit folks as well. So there are not often comparable statistics on income for people who are trans, but this slide does show a little bit about some of the data from 2021. And considering these rates in 2021, you can extrapolate that they will have been exacerbated for years past. So this is showing that all LGBTQ folks earn about 90% of the average worker, trans men earning about 70, as well as non-binary, gender non-conforming, and two-spirit folks as sort of a broad category. And then with trans women earning on average 60% of the average worker. And that's just from 2021. So that's this year. And we can't imagine how much worse it was before this data was being collected. So this slide shows how race and gender disparities intersect. While economic inequality is continuing to expand in the US, racial and gender inequality continues, and women of color not only have to deal with the gender wage gap, but also with the racial wage gap. So you can imagine, and you can see visually here how that plays out. These inequalities of race and gender exist not only because of individual bias, but also because of particular rules and policies that we will discuss in more detail in a few minutes. We also think of education as the great equalizer, but this slide shows that income disparities play out at nearly every education level. The last slide about income and the wage gap when correlated for educational attainment. So we often think of education as the great equalizer. People refer to that in politics all of the time, even though we all know how school funding can play out and all sorts of policies that we'll talk about in a minute. The dark blue lines here are the average hourly wages for white workers, while the light blue lines are the average hourly wages for Black workers, the middle medium blue being Hispanic workers. And unfortunately, this chart is only often broken out into those three categories. The top of the graph is for workers with less than a high school education, while the bottom is for workers with advanced degrees. So you'll sort of see how that can change. So what we assume from looking at that is that despite increases in educational attainment over the last 25 years, communities of color have not, it has not borne out in terms of wages. Another thing to note that is not represented here in this slide is that despite increased educational attainment over the last 25 years for Indigenous communities, Native Americans have the lowest educational achievement rates in comparison to other national, racial, and ethnic groups, and some of the least investment in their concentrated communities by the federal government in education. According to the 2012 to 17 Census Bureau data, 14.3% of Native Americans have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 15.2% of Hispanics and 20.6% of Black Americans and 34.5% of whites. So now Hannah will talk a little bit about wealth.
All right, let's talk about wealth. Remember that wealth is what you own minus what you owe. It is possible to have negative wealth to owe more than you own. According to the New York Federal Reserve, 14% of the US population has negative wealth. The type of wealth can vary greatly depending on whether you're lower income, middle income, or in the top 1%. Lower income people may have furniture or a car. Middle income people may have equity in a house, a small business, or a retirement fund. The top 1% may have real estate, large stock, and bond holdings, businesses, or art. This slide shows household median net worth by race. In some ways, wealth is more important for understanding social inequality because wealth actually generates income. So income inequality depends partly on wealth inequality. Research on racial inequality argues that a large part of inequality between African Americans and whites is due to differences in wealth and discrimination against Black folks in the acquisition of wealth, particularly housing. While we often focus on the wage gap between women and men, the wealth gap is even bigger. In 2013, single women had 32 cents to every dollar of wealth held by single men. Women of color are not only impacted by the racial wealth gap, but also by the gender wealth gap. This slide shows the percentage of each race that was living in poverty in 2015, including Indigenous peoples. You'll see here that the levels of poverty experienced in Indigenous peoples were similar to the levels experienced in Black communities, and that trend extends far prior to 2015 as well. And just to note, this is the percentage of each race for transgender people living in poverty in 2015. Now we're going to turn our attention to how we got here. Ella?
Thanks. So this next slide here is quite the complicated one. I am going to track down the link to this slide at some point and put it in the chat so that folks can peruse through it on your own. When we sort of get started in the activity, I'll pop it into the chat. But for now, I will leave this slide up. So it helps to examine history when trying to understand why things are the way they are today. History makes it clear that we're not in this situation. You know, we've just talked about all of these statistics. We've seen all of these charts showing that the more intersectional your identity, the more barriers you have. And that is not natural in the way that it has to be or preordained. Economic, political, and cultural forces have shaped the very rules of the world today and have set us up for where we are. So when we examine history, we should pay close attention to the fundamental role that government policies played in shaping the distribution of wealth, especially with regard to the racial wealth divide. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been impacted by public policies created specifically to limit their rights as human beings and citizens. These discriminatory public policies have often systematically blocked wealth accumulation while opening opportunities for white people, and that's on purpose. Even so-called colorblind policies have racialized outcomes. For example, although Black Americans who have served in the US military during World War II were entitled to free college education and subsidized home mortgages thanks to the GI Bill, many universities systematically blocked Black Americans and other veterans of color and women from becoming students. And real estate owners, brokers, and local ordinances blocked Black people from buying homes in desirable neighborhoods. It's important that we not only ask whether there is equality of opportunity, but also whether there is equality of condition and equality of outcome. So the slide in front of you is called "The Government Boosts and Blocks to Building Wealth." It looks at about 250 years of government policy in this country and how these policies have created wealth for some people and stolen wealth from others. So let's look at a few examples that I'll kind of specifically point out to you all. The origins of wealth in the United States go back to the land theft and genocide of Indigenous peoples and the labor of enslaved African people. You can see moments in history like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is right around the left-hand side of the blocks section. You can also see the annexation of Mexican land in the 1840s that turned land theft and colonization into official government policy. I'll also draw your attention to the economic support offered during the New Deal era. It was often available only to white people. And the Social Security Act, for example, which provided a safety net for millions of workers, denied benefits to domestic and agricultural workers, who were mostly people of color. Many of our families benefited from the creation of Social Security in 1935, and many of our families did not. we're going to take a few minutes to look at and consider this timeline. So I'm going to talk about a couple of questions that we're going to consider and sort of discuss in the chat. And I would encourage you to change your chat response to everybody so that when you're replying, everybody can see what you're saying. I will pop the link into the chat so that you can open this page in your browser, or unless somebody else did it, which I will find out in a moment. And I'm going to go over a couple of questions that we're going to be discussing and responding to in the chat. So as you look at the racial wealth divide graphic, where are there moments in the timeline when you see race playing a role in wealth accumulation? Are there moments in history when you see new elements of a racial wealth divide emerging? Do you see policies on the timeline that have affected you or your family or your community? In what way? Was there an equal opportunity for all in those policies? What about equal conditions or outcomes? So we're going to consider these questions. I'm going to copy and paste them into the chat. I'm going to go back to the racial wealth divide slide. And I think I'm going to give us, let's see what time it is here. I think we'll take up to, I say 5 to 10 minutes, depending on when we're running out of steam. And we'll sort of look over this and respond to some of the questions in the chat. I am going to paste the questions in the chat as well as the link to find this page, as I mentioned. But we'll just give some awkward silence for a few minutes, and I'll try to read aloud some examples as people are interacting. Okay, so as you can see, Zuri posted the Boosts and Blocks faireconomy.org link into the chat. So thank you so much. So it's faireconomy.org. It's in the chat there. You can use that link if you want to open it on your browser and sort of zoom in a little bit. You can also download it. And Hannah is now typing the questions into the chat. And I will give everybody a few minutes to sort of consider these questions. If you want to private chat with each other, private chat with staff, or just pop your ideas into the chat there, and I'll give some examples in a moment. Okay, so we have a couple examples coming into the chat here. Some folks whose family benefited from the GI Bill and being a veteran was sold a parcel of land for a very affordable price, which is not necessarily an equitable outcome for other folks. The New Deal is both a boost and a block, being both racist and exclusionary, but also a program that created a lot of social programs for people, but also blocked minorities from participating. The overlap between the New Deal and redlining. Redlining is a policy that specifically disallowed people of color from buying houses in favorable neighborhoods. Has anyone noticed moments in the racial wealth divide where you see a new element of a racial wealth divide emerging? I don't think we've had any responses to that question in the chat yet. Folks mentioning the histories of redlining and their family's ability to buy property in the neighborhoods they wanted. If your children are nearby, plug their ears because we're having a couple fuck yous to Christopher Columbus in the chat as well. The theft of indigenous lands has been brought up as the root of the block, but it's also definitely a moment in history where a new, quote unquote, new moment of the racial wealth divide emerges. The destruction of Black Wall Street and land allotment is also an example being brought up in the chat here. So let's keep this conversation going both in the chat and maybe Hannah, we could start a conversation somewhere in Slack around the racial wealth divide and some examples and some policy discussions over there in the Slack space, as well as continue it in the chat. So, let's see. Of course, policies that create and maintain the racial wealth divide are not just in the past. Many current policies also lead to the upward distribution of wealth and power. So some examples of this are the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Many of you may remember a massive tax cut for the wealthy purported to be a tax cut for the middle class, many of whom didn't see much of a tax cut at all. The criminalization and lack of federal recognition of the legalization of marijuana is a policy that creates and maintains the racial wealth divide to this day. As I'm sure many of you know, especially Black people and people of color in this nation are disproportionately arrested and penalized for possession of marijuana specifically, but also all drugs, all illegal substances. And another policy that I think personally definitely maintains the racial wealth divide is the sad, pathetic, low minimum wage that we have in this country. The fact that our minimum wage is not a living wage in most places, especially communities in cities where people of color live and work, and continuously cannot afford to live in the communities where they work because the cost of living is shooting up and the minimum wage has not raised for many, many years, and you have to rely on your state government to support you in that way. It's a sad state of affairs, as we all know. For as long as the racial wealth divide has existed, though, there's been resistance to both the policies and the outcomes. Sometimes this resistance has been through policy change, and sometimes it's been at a community level, and sometimes it's looked entirely different. So some of these examples of a form of resistance to the racial wealth divide were actually mentioned in the chat through some of our conversations that we've been having. Specifically, Black Wall Street in Tulsa was an explicit form of resistance to the racial wealth divide, where a community of Black residents of Tulsa built their own wealth, their own Wall Street, and built a thriving community on their own that didn't rely on white folks to dictate the terms of their wealth acquisition. And obviously, white folks destroyed that building of wealth. Another example of resistance is community-driven microloans. An example in Montana is the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Mutual Aid Fund. But there are many mutual aid funds and community-driven microloan funds throughout the nation for communities of color, for people leaving incarceration, for trans people of color leaving incarceration. You know, you really can get very specific or very broad. Also, some folks in the chat here, Native American owned marijuana businesses can't get bank accounts in traditional banking institutions with the current federal laws restricting tribes getting into the industry. So that is a perfect example of current policies that are maintaining the racial wealth divide in this nation. Oh, and another example here about the foster system, white families adopting Indigenous children without any sort of cultural competency or policies to address the difficulties that may arise for that child from having, you know, a separation from their own culture and their own traditions, and even having access to that information. A question in the chat here. So regarding minimum wage, Holly, this is a great question regarding some sources and statistics about how many minimum wage workers are women, how many minimum wage workers are trans or gender nonconforming folks, and how many minimum wage workers are various races. I will work to get some of that information to you, Holly, and try to get it into the Slack as well. So thank you for that question. Awesome. Well, that is just a little bit of information and some examples around some policies that are upholding the racial wealth divide and some policies that are providing resistance. Keep on thinking about these types of policies and keep on discussing these issues. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to lead us into one other more forward-thinking, more positive activity to close off this evening. Thanks for all the great discussion going on in the chat as well.
Sweet, thank you. So let's do a fun activity. So review the policy examples that are on this slide. Choose one, or for extra credit, you could think of a policy in your local community that you'd want to consider. So I'm going to say these questions, but I'll also put them in the chat. What does the policy that you choose seek to accomplish? Will it reduce disparities or discrimination? What negative impacts or unintended consequences could result from this policy, and who could be negatively affected? And what positive impacts on equality and inclusion, if any, could result from this proposal, and who could benefit? So please just place your answers in the chat. And yeah. We'll focus on this for a few minutes. But I also would encourage you to go to the Slack after this if you want to talk further about any of these questions. And I'll be posting the questions on there afterwards as well.
I'll show the questions again in for a moment on the screen, but then I'll go back to the policies in a moment. And as folks are looking this over, I will share one of my own examples of a policy that some folks are interested in implementing in my hometown, just as an example of choosing my own policy. So this policy is passenger rail, government subsidized passenger rail, and they're hoping to get that through central, through some other communities of Montana that don't currently have passenger rail: Helena, Butte, Missoula, Bozeman. And this policy seeks to accomplish more opportunities for travel and tourism for Montanans and for other people coming into the state. Cheap travel that isn't a car from city to city for folks living in Montana. It can reduce disparities and discrimination depending on, you know, how accessible the train stations are, you know, depending on how it's implemented. The negative impacts or unintended consequences could result from putting train stations in neighborhoods that are inaccessible to certain communities, from not making the stations accessible, for not subsidizing the tickets or making certain sections of the train that are affordable for certain communities. And the positive impacts are basically what I already mentioned in terms of those general positive impacts of increased public transportation options. So that would be my little pet project example. We do have some other folks. Hannah, do you want to share some of the stuff people have been sharing in the chat?
Yeah, so it looks like Hannah said there's also a lot of tax benefits / deductions with regard to owning a home. This causes those who already own valuable homes to be able to build more wealth and pass that to their descendants. It's true. Land back land reparations restores civil and criminal jurisdictions and management. It restores indigenous management of natural resources and restores the political power of tribes in the global world by giving equity as recognized nations. Yeah, I agree. It looks like there's also another resource that someone suggested in the chat. Any and all things you all recommend, I would say go for it, put it in the chat. We're all learning together and we're all valuable in this space. All right, so it looks like folks are finished up putting their answers in the chat. Oh, let's see, universal healthcare could help inequalities in healthcare. These are deep questions that I appreciate. Thanks. Student debt relief impacts wealth gap by forgiving debt. Equity impacts women of color carry a proportionate amount of student debt. Some challenges of that are privately held student debt, which, like other predatory lending, targets communities of color and single women. Agree. And then Jan said, comprehensive, preventative, accessible, culturally appropriate across the lifespan. Healthcare is a human right. This policy does not require a job, spouse, parents' ability to pay, where you live, who you love. This must be a national priority and not dependent on state or local governments to determine. I think the recent funds that went in directly to all of us last year, plus the stipends for families with kids, which pulled thousands of families out of poverty, is an argument for universal basic income. Pardon me not using the correct language. No, these are all great answers. And thank you all for being so thoughtful in the chat. Okay. How about climate justice? Because low income and BIPOC communities tend to be forced to live near polluted and corporate polluting sites. Yeah, climate justice is huge and definitely tied into this. I find that a lot of issues are like interrelated and definitely overlap. Yeah. I would continue to put your your answers in the chat. And like I said, we can talk about this in the Slack afterwards. And I would love to hear from you all. But this kind of leads us into like what policies we're working on now and what policies are being discussed by other organizers in an attempt to address the racial wealth divide. So Ella will lead us through that.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for participating. I know it's kind of hard with webinar style in the chat, but we'll keep talking about this, and we're so excited to be discussing these topics. It's really important to be considering how all of our identities intersect and how my role as a person with certain identities is connected to every other struggle out there. And it is so important for me to be advocating for all of these policies and to be considering policy outcomes and things that I can advocate for in my community and my state that will address some of these issues, and to be considering the ways that my privileges and the privileges of my family historically, have led to the position that I'm in now, and what's my responsibility to do with that privilege. So what we're working on at Montana Women Vote, a lot of the policies and issue areas that we talked about today, that we'll be talking about for the rest of the week, could in some ways impact the racial wealth divide. And here on this slide are just a couple of examples. You'll hear a little bit this week about criminal justice reform. And hopefully you'll continue to keep an eye on Montana Women Vote's mailing list so you can get opportunities to participate in criminal justice reform efforts going on across the state. We'll communicate with you about what local organizers are doing on the ground, as well as what's going on in the legislature and at the state agency level. Access to healthcare. As many of you know who have watched us over the years, Montana Women Vote is one of the leading organizations in the healthcare coalitions in Montana that are working to pass and maintain Medicaid expansion, hopefully even continue expanding access to healthcare in the state. So keep an eye on all of our things for future information on that. You'll hear about voting rights tomorrow from some very smart people who we're excited to hear from. The earned income tax credit is an issue that Montana Women Vote's been talking about for many years, and we always advocate for in the legislative session. That has a huge benefit for all families. Non-discrimination ordinances that can happen at the local level, the state level, and nationally, protecting people in income or in employment and housing. Paid family and medical leave, as we all know, having just experienced and continuing to experience a pandemic, being here in our homes, having access to paid family and medical leave is huge for so many folks, as well as paid sick days. So keep an eye on our email list and our socials for all of these issues. There's also obviously lots of issues and policies that people out there are dreaming about, including us, and working towards, that would be absolutely foundational to shifting the racial wealth divide. And if you're interested in any of these issues and you don't have access to the Slack, you should get in touch with us, but you should also chat about some of these ideas and issues in the Slack and share articles and other organizations. And some examples of this are things we've talked about today, like reparations, prison abolition. Prison abolition, what we mean when we say that, it actually means not using the carceral prison system as the way that we punish people in this nation. So it's a pretty complicated issue that a lot of people have done a great job of breaking down and analyzing. We've talked about it on some of our sessions. You'll hear about it if you come to our criminal justice reform session. Prison abolition, land back and land reparations, universal health care, and universal basic incomes. So these are just some examples of some dreams that we have, some things that we would really love to work towards in the long term that would be foundational changes. So just to close off, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. I know that these issues are huge. I really want to thank Howell and Hannah for joining me this evening to talk about Montana Women Vote, some of our history, some of the things we're looking forward to this year. These issues of identity and policy and learning and taking action, all of these things are tied together. And it is all what comes together to make the Women's Policy Leadership Institute. It's exactly why we're all here, to affirm our identities, to learn, to share, and to be together with other people who understand our experience and share our values. So we're so excited to be here with you today. And we're so excited to have you join us for the rest of the conference. Thank you for attending this session of WPLI. If we weren't able to answer your question, you can email us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We are going to add the evaluation form in the chat. I do see that there's a hand raised, so I'll unmute you in just a moment. But if you complete the evaluation, you'll be entered to win a copy of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by our keynote speaker, Aubrey Gordon. It is a signed copy, and it's an extremely exciting prize. I will be filling out the evaluations myself and evaluating myself quite highly, shall I say. And there'll be a full recording of this session available on our website very soon. I can't tell you exactly when, but it'll definitely be by the end of the conference, hopefully sooner. Thank you for attending, and I will now answer some questions and stay on with those who are interested or have your hands raised to see what questions you may have. Sorry, it'll just take me a minute to navigate around. I think I'm gonna have to close the slideshow. Okay, if you had your hand raised, I lost you. So you should lower it and raise it again. Or put your question in the chat. Thank you everyone for all your kind words and compliments. I will not be reading them out loud. All right, everyone. Well, thank you all for joining us. You can log off now. I'll stay for a few minutes for final questions or thoughts. Thank you so much. See you later this week.